Ready? Play.
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whatever time it is in the world, wherever you are tuning in from. Where Will is tuning in from, it is mid-afternoon. How are you doing, Will?
Doing good. Been a busy week catching up on Breakpoint, which I know we're going to discuss here, and finishing up a few projects so I can watch a lot of grass court tennis over the next 2 weeks.
Indeed, Will. Will, what do you think about? Let's begin with this. What do you think about the timing of the release of these episodes? Because we had one, I think, just on the eve of the Australian Open. Now we've had another one sandwiched between the French Open and Wimbledon.
hmm
I know how I feel about that, but I'm just thinking about me, okay?
Yeah.
And I'd rather it was released at a different time. But do you think it makes sense to release it at these times?
I think it's smart because the only times that the average sports fan, not a diehard tennis fan, can actually watch tennis, which means, especially in the US, anyways. I guess you can let me know what you think as far as Europe goes. Um, the average like sports fan does not watch Tennis Channel. They're just not going to. So it has to be ESPN, and that is the Australian Open, that is Wimbledon, that is the US Open. So those are the only times that the average sports fan can watch tennis. So it makes sense to release it on Netflix, because when you log into your Netflix account, it's a trending show, and then somebody who's never watched tennis just clicks on it, watches it, gets into it. Then a week later, they see it on ESPN and they're like, "Oh, I saw that guy on Netflix. Now I'm going to watch." Versus if it was 3 months later, they flip on ESPN, maybe they forgot Tiafoe's name or forgot about his story or something like that. So I think it's smart. I think it's a good idea
I'm
as
sure.
far as the US perspective. But what do you think? What are your
Well,
thoughts?
I think I'm just thinking about it from my perspective, whether I'm
Yeah.
European or otherwise. I would rather it was during the off season, but I think you make some excellent points, and I reckon Netflix have a big enough capability, and also the guys that make Breakpoint, that they probably know what they're doing, and they figured it out with their focus groups and
Yeah.
surveys and stuff, that they know what they're doing. I'm just saying it from my point of view as a hardened tennis fan.
Yeah.
I don't think they're aiming for me, and that makes sense. Like, this is not actually a
Right.
criticism here, but it's just that there's probably lulls in the calendar, i.e., just after the Australian Open or
hmm
November, December time. Those are the probably periods, or even just after the US Open. There's probably about 3 or 4 periods in the year when John, would rather have it
Yeah.
on. But
Yeah.
I recognize that they have other ones. But do you see where I'm coming from, though?
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, I agree with you. Ultimately, I think what we should both want is what's best for the sport. And that means, I think, releasing them at these times before that the tournaments are going to have a large viewership. Because yeah, we're not the target, I don't think
No.
so.
Will, on that
Anyways,
point, okay, I know you and I discussed the first season about 6 months ago, and obviously now we've just had the second season. I have seen all bar 10 minutes of the second season. I've got the final episode on my screen right now, but I've basically
okay.
seen all the second season. I think you're still missing the last episode. Am I right, Will?
Correct. I've not watched the last one yet,
But but,
which
but
I'm
basically,
excited about. Yeah.
I think
I,
you've got 9 out of 10, if you like, from the episodes, and I've got
mhm,
9.8 out of 10. So I think we're in a pretty good place to
yeah.
discuss this. What my thoughts after the first season were sort of some things right, some things wrong. I will elaborate a bit more, perhaps not so much on that, but the second season, I actually have similar feelings now about the
hmm
second season as well. I think you were a little bit more enthusiastic about the first season.
Yeah.
Broadly, is your enthusiasm increased in terms of what you think you saw? Do you think it's actually been a bit underwhelming, or where are you at right now, Will, regarding the second season?
I think my enthusiasm has decreased a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah, I keep kind of going back and forth on this. Like when I'm watching it, I'm watching it for two reasons. One, my own entertainment. I just want to, get to know these players better and these players that I watch play tennis and I don't follow their personal lives to the extent that you can. I don't really follow it a whole lot. Like the curious off the court issues at Wimbledon when he was, um, I guess his ex girlfriend had filed a lawsuit or something. Like I
Mhm.
don't read those stories because I'm just not that interested in them. Their off the court stuff. So that's one reason I watch, to just learn a little bit more about that and my own entertainment, and then also just to get a gauge for how is tennis doing as a whole, in terms of marketing, and how is this going to help tennis, potentially in the way that it did F1 or that it might with the golf series as well. So those are the two angles I'm looking at it from. And for this season, the second half of this first season, yeah, I don't think they stepped up a whole lot, in terms of, when you compare the first 5 episodes to the last, 4 that I've watched. And I think that the big or the important thing that they have to be able to do in the Serena episode, which we'll talk about, I think highlighted this for me, is they've got to create fans of individual players, right? Because they're not gonna get someone to fall in love with tennis as a sport, I don't think, with these series, but they can get someone to fall in love with Francis Tiafoe, which I think they did the best job with him.
Mhm.
Um, or they could get someone to fall in love with Nick Kyrgios and just become a Nick Kyrgios fan.
Mhm.
And I think that's what one thing they did do a good job of was showing how big Serena was, like
Mhm.
how much she transcended the sport. And she, through her career brought so many people to the sport of tennis that would have never otherwise cared because they were Serena fans before they were tennis fans. So I was hoping they would dig more into, and maybe like Curios and some of these other players, they just like don't want to reveal too much about their personal lives. I don't know, but I was hoping that they would be able to like paint that picture, I don't know, in a more compelling way. But maybe for non-tennis fans, it was. I'm not sure.
Probably, if I'm guessing here, after the first season, you were kind of giving it a 6.5 out of 10, something like that, 7 out of
Yeah,
10. I was
yeah,
probably a bit closer to the sort of 5 out of 10,
yeah.
slightly disappointed. I would say that am still at around about that area, but I will
Yeah.
say this: after episodes 6 and 7, I was really going quite low and quite harsh.
Mm.
I was making the thumbnail for this episode about 3 hours ago before I'd seen episodes 8, 9, and now pretty much 10. And I was ready to go for it. But I think it saved itself a bit. As you mentioned during the Serena story, Tom Yanovich, of course, plays a huge role in that. I also
Mm.
like the Annette Kontaveit pits as well. But anyway, and I also think Arena Sabalenka as well. But I'm getting ahead of ourselves in the episodes. Let's try and do this. I know you've only got half an hour or so, but let's try and just rewind, therefore, to episode 6, Belonging. I will
Mhm.
share my thoughts on this, and also, before you go as well, some broader thoughts on what I think they could have done a little bit better as well. But I was in this episode. I appear for about 10 seconds. Will, I don't know if you've seen me
Oh, I
showing off
didn't
like that.
notice.
Yeah, that's okay. Don't worry. You had to
I
be
might have
pretty.
been looking away or something.
Yeah, you blink and you miss it. But I was let's see if I can just very quickly share my screen here where I get my 10 seconds of fame.
Yeah,
Um,
we've gotta see it.
this is my head. Can you see the screen, by the way?
Yeah, I
This
can.
is my head here, and they've described me as man 3. I'm not going to press play just in case
Oh.
but I was at this press conference with Nick Kyrgios, and I simply said to him, because he's coming into the press conference, he's complained about the officials, he's complained about somebody who he describes as an old man. I think he said he was 90 years old.
Mhm,
This was after the first round, and what I didn't like, and it's probably because I have a personal interest in this. The media was painted because they showed his buddy, his pal, who's kind of with him throughout.
mhm,
They've talked about his history with depression and how suicidal he felt 3 or 4 years ago in 2019. And then they
Mhm.
show the media as though we're kind of hounding. We're not hounding him. We're just
Mhm.
because then they show his buddy sort of shaking his head. They then show the vitriol of abuse that he gets on social media. But Nick actually highlights. He says, "Yeah, but the umpires, they don't have to worry about the millions of pounds or the social media." Well, I think that doesn't mean you can abuse them. That doesn't mean it
Yeah.
doesn't just because they're not earning millions, that doesn't mean you have the right to abuse them.
Yeah.
Um, so I just asked him a very fair question. I said, "Do you have any sympathy for how they're treated sometimes?" And I wasn't the only person there in the press room, and I actually
Yeah.
think Nick gets a very, as do probably all of the tennis players, including the controversial ones, including their controversial moments. I think the media, because we know we still have to tiptoe. We have to tiptoe over certain issues because, especially if you're a beginner like me, you don't want to lose that press accreditation. And you know that if you upset Nick Kyrgios and he says, I don't want him in my press conferences, that's a pretty short argument. And Nick wins day in, day out, and I'm gone.
Right. Yeah.
Um, and I think even some of the more established ones, we do tiptoe around this issue. And anyway, so
Mhm.
that's my thoughts on that. Nick Kyrgios as well, generally. The other thing was why Nick Kyrgios twice. I don't think he was the story of 2022 tennis wise in that big a way. So
Yeah.
yeah, I've had my thoughts. Anyway, go on, Will.
Yeah. Um, I mean, I think focusing on Curious Twice actually was smart because he's kind of the colorful guy who is going to generate a younger audience to the sport. And he can potentially make for good TV. They showed, I think it was at the end of episode 8 or 9, maybe at the U.S. Open when he lost to Hatchinov, um, him smashing his racket and stuff. And they didn't really highlight that much. Like they showed him throwing his racket in all 9 episodes I've watched, maybe a handful of times, but they didn't really dive into it a whole lot about how. I mean, they could have brought up how Nadal's never broken a racket, and
Hmm.
uh, I don't know how it's kind of a thing. Um, I guess it's not like surprising, but it's like it gets news when a player smashes rackets like that, right?
Well, I think when you're
It gets
there in
some
the
headlines.
arena, sorry to interrupt,
Hmm.
but I want to say something or add something to what you're saying.
Yeah,
When you're in the arena, I think it is even more uncomfortable. Maybe on TV, maybe watching on
yeah,
Netflix. When you're watching it back on YouTube, it sort of may seem a bit fun and stuff, but I've seen it in the arena and it's a bit uncomfortable because
yeah,
it is a bit spoilt bratish.
yeah, yeah. It is for sure. I mean, yeah, it creates a different type of tension that you really don't
I,
kind
I-
of
I'm not.
want
I'm
in the
not completely
sport.
anti. By the
But
way, he also did something probably far worse in Indian Wells that didn't get mentioned during the first season as well. When he basically, I think he was. Did he hit a ball boy? Get close to hitting a ball boy or something? But anyway, any other thoughts on belonging before we move on to the next episode?
no, I thought they did a good job of demonstrating how kind of prestigious Wimbledon is. I thought that was fair, and something I found with all of with the entire season is they like you can't every tournament can't be the biggest tournament of the year, right? There has to be one that's the biggest tournament of the year, but it does when they go from one Grand Slam to the next. It does seem like that's the biggest one when they'll interview the players and they'll be like, "Oh, Wimbledon's the pinnacle," and then they go to New York and they're like, "New York under the lights, like that's what you dream of as a kid." So they make each one, they really build it up and do a good job of that. Um, but yeah, no other thoughts on episode 6 that come to mind.
Saints and Sinner, I think is the or Saints and Sinners, I think is the episode 7. It's got
Mhm.
nothing to do with Yannick Sinner, I believe, which you might think of at the beginning there. But so this really does, also have Wimbledon as well as part of its theme. A couple of things here that this is really by episode 7 is when I was at my low point regarding the series. I was going to continue watching it
Mhm.
primarily for the purpose of this episode, but I may have been tempted to stop watching at this point and maybe return at another point, maybe after Wimbledon or maybe not at all. A
Mhm.
couple of things I've noted from this episode. Well, first of all, I've not noted any things. That's the first sign. Second thing is Iga was out and there was no mention of it at Wimbledon. I just knew it happened. when she
Yeah.
lost to Elise Cornet.
Hmm.
By the way, it does, and I was also getting frustrated with the fact that Iga had barely been mentioned, and we were at the end of July, and she'd been unbeaten for 35, 40 matches or whatever, and she'd been dominating the
Yeah.
tour. And I know they come to it towards the end, which is perhaps why I softened my approach. Another thing as
Yeah.
well, Wimbledon, Serena Williams, nothing
Yeah.
on her, her departure from the tournament, but also it was getting closer now to looking like the end for her. I was at her press conference at Wimbledon after she lost, which was just packed, probably even more than probably as much, or if not more than any other press conference there, including Rafa Nadal, including Novak, including Kyrgios, where there's obviously a bit more buzz as well with their press conferences. So
Hmm.
by the end of episode 7, I actually think I probably wouldn't have watched any more, certainly until after Wimbledon. I don't know what you were thinking at this point.
Yeah. Yeah, they covered Jabeur again as well. And they briefly mentioned, so Kyrgios makes the run. He gets a default in the semis.
Yeah.
And they briefly mentioned his scandal, but they didn't really dive into it a whole lot, which maybe that's by design. I don't know. But I think I mentioned on our last call back in January or February, where like the thing that the F1 series does so well, and golf did a good job of it as well. I'm forgetting the name of the golf one, but uh, anyways, is they create tension within each episode, and that's something the tennis ones haven't been able to do a whole lot. They create where you're like rooting for one side or another. You're rooting for Hamilton or Verstappen, you know. So
But there
I
isn't
think
much of that in tennis right now. I mean, maybe Rafa Novak with the fans.
there's not, but they've got to find a way to create that. And Kyrgios is a very polarizing uh, player who I think if they're going to create it with anyone, it could be him. So I don't know if it's that, I'm not trained in PR. I don't know like how this stuff works. So I'll put that disclaimer out there. But diving a little more into that scandal could have done that. It could have been like they could have showed, here are the accusations, here's Curious side of the story, and left the viewer to like kind of decide for themselves, like, oh, this guy's getting screwed. She just sees all his bunny, or like, um, this guy's a bad dude. Like we should not, and they could have like created some of that tension. I don't know.
I also think there will. I think again, this is even a beast such as Netflix. Probably, if Nick is going to give him such good access, and he probably is one of the players that says, "Yeah, come to my house, no problem," as he did
Yeah,
in
that's
in
true.
Melbourne. That
Mhm.
they are also gonna. I would imagine that Nick will watch these
Yeah,
episodes and be, "Yep, I'm pretty happy with that." Um,
yeah, and get a
and
season 2. Yeah,
right, so I just think that there may
good
be a bit
point.
of that at play as well.
Yeah, good point. Good point.
Can we get
Anyways,
to
yeah,
can we get to New York, by the way? Because I do think this is where my interest went up a little bit.
yeah,
Let's
let's
say.
do that. I don't
I
think there was a whole lot else with Wimbledon
no, I mean, you go like
to
Ons was
discuss.
good, and there is some other good stuff, and there's some good
Yeah.
storylines. But when you mentioned the tension, by the way, I wasn't quite sure whether you meant between players or between fans, or even just the tension of certain matches. Um, because when you mention Formula One, when you mention golf, and then also tennis, and I know a lot of sports are like this, but you are kind of millimeters from greatness and millimeters from failure.
Mhm.
Even football really doesn't very often happen. It does. It might happen in a season, or it might happen every 5 years. In English Premier League history or English top flight history, I think there's only been 2 occasions in 150 years when it's gone down to the last couple of minutes of the season.
Mhm.
Okay, I quite liked a narrative where there was a match between Manchester City and Liverpool a few years ago, and it was just a few millimeters from going over the line. But actually, this happens, quite often in tennis, and I'm sure it happens in golf and also Formula One, where the margins are so fine. I
Mhm.
wonder if the makers, the people behind it, maybe they were Formula One fans anyway. Maybe they knew a little bit more about the sport going into Formula One and making that documentary. Then afterwards, they're like, "Well, you've done an amazing job. Can you do something similar for tennis?" Well, yeah, we're filmmakers. I'm sure we could. and they've maybe even I don't know. I'm just speculating. Maybe they've learned on the job as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's possible. I mean, I think part of it that I discussed last time is Formula One just kind of lends itself to this sort
Maybe,
of
yeah.
documentary, anyways. Like it's at the end of, excuse me, at the end of almost like every race 3 or 4 years ago, Verstappen and Hamilton were 1-2, right? So it's like if
Did
we
they
had
get?
Nadal and Djokovic at the finals of every tournament, like
Yeah,
they could make a series about that, but they play
yeah.
each other like 3 times a year, so it's like it's a little bit more difficult. And something else I noticed is like a lot of, especially at the US Open, a lot of the time they were showing the matches and then that scoreboard flashes up and it's like set 1, 7-6 or whatever. And they're not even showing the points a lot of the time. They're showing somebody hitting in slow motion with a commentator in the background talking about it, and like they don't even show the actual tennis for a lot of it, which I found
I also
interesting, disappointing, surprising. I don't know.
I also find their scoreboarding a little confusing because I'm looking at it and I'm looking
It
at the bigger
is,
number and the smaller number, and I've never seen it written like that in my entire life. And so actually,
yeah,
I'm seeing it flick over and I'm thinking, oh, he's 2 sets to 1 up. No, it's is that 2 games to 1, and I even know the match they're talking about. So I think that
yeah,
they've got to fix that and really should have had. I mean, the way you normally see it on the screen with one player above the other, maybe, but whatever. I've seen it in other documentaries and films and stuff where it's quite clear. But
yeah,
I don't think they do a good job there. That's for sure. But I think you're right about points. I mean, the series is called Break Point, right? And yet they
yeah,
don't really talk about points. I mean, we've got Fairy Tale in New York now as episode 8, and like I said, I do think it does rescue itself a bit in episodes 8 and 9. And I love, you're
yeah,
right, some of the panoramic stuff they do in New York, and I get a real sense of the city and the size of the occasion as well. Especially as they
yeah,
did a really good job with Francis Tiafoe, I think, and Tiafoe, of course, being one of the biggest characters. I loved as well, even just a few snippets from Taylor Fritz at the beginning. You can't, as a big tennis fan, I kind of forgot about how disastrous the US Open was for him going out in round 1, and getting
hmm,
some snippets from him about the pressure and the expectation, which funny enough, he told me in a press conference at Wimbledon last year, in that he actually feels more pressure when he's the overwhelming favorite. Well, he backed that up by
there
his
you go.
performance in the US Open.
Yeah,
I also really liked. It's heartbreaking, but it's also good. And I'm sure Annette Kontaveit was more than happy to share these images. Of course, the angle that they went for with the Serena narrative as well. They also got the opponent's angle, including Kontaveit, who was not
hmm,
really a major part of the series. It's a bit different with Tomjanovic, but with
hmm,
Kontaveit, you really felt for her, and how you saw the crowd cheering her faulting and double faulting, and she was. I'm not having a go at the crowd here, but I just like the fact that
yeah,
you got to see Annette Kontaveit and her
yeah.
horrible side of the story, if you like.
It was good. I'm curious if somebody was watching it who doesn't know tennis as well, um, their perspective on that, because I could see, like, you and I know how big of a deal that is for the crowd to be cheering like that, but somebody who doesn't follow the sport, maybe they're a basketball fan and like, yeah, I always cheer like really loud and yell at the opposing team when they're shooting free throws. Like in tennis, that's not really a thing. You don't cheer for double faults, and people who don't know the sport may not know that. So I think they could have maybe done a better job of illustrating that, or I don't know. I'm curious to hear what somebody would think.
Yeah, but I say I think it did pick up, and I think there's one or two people in the chat that are agreeing with me. 8 and 9 is
Yeah,
where the series was saved. What else have I got here regarding that episode? Um,
they did a
uh,
great job with Tiafo. I
they
thought,
did,
and
they
I
did.
mentioned that at the beginning, and like going through his story, going back to the club, getting
Yeah,
his whole family at dinner. Yeah, they did a great job with him. Like that reminded
yeah.
me
The
of,
family dinner was great. I agree.
yeah, like I knew his story, but as I was watching that episode, I was thinking like about, the US has been waiting for this like a top American male player for a long time, which they touched on, and like it could be Fritz, but Tiafo would be better. Like he would get more fans with his story, with his background. Like he is, I think it was Muradoglu who said like he is the American dream or something
Yeah,
like that.
Yeah, that was a good
Um,
line. Yeah.
and and yeah, like they did a really good job of covering that. I couldn't remember. So when he beat Nadal, did Nadal not have an injury during that match?
Yeah, and basically Nadal, as Tony told me in an interview earlier this year, it said his body went down after Wimbledon, and he
Okay.
picked up. He had his abdominal injury at Wimbledon. He then basically rushed back for Cincinnati and then the U.S. Open. And I think that it flared up again before the U.S. Open. We didn't know it publicly, but his service speeds were down. Blah 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 blah. That's not to take
Okay.
anything away from Tiafoe, who was sensational, not just that night in New York, but throughout the tournament,
Okay.
and may well have beaten Rafa anyway. But let's just say it was an off-color Rafa.
Yeah. Yeah, they didn't mention that. I thought he had gotten hurt during the match, but I guess it was just
Not
kind of a
really, no. There was
nagging.
another
No.
one before that when
Okay.
he smashed his nose with a racket. I don't know if you saw that at all.
Yeah, I
Any
remember that. Yeah.
yeah. So that
Yeah.
happened, but that wasn't necessarily one of the biggest storylines that not just last year, but also at the US Open. I do
Right.
think that they could have done a bit more with Serena Williams' last ever game, which I think had about 8 juices. She saved about 6 match points
Oh,
and
that's right.
was just an epic game and an epic way for her to end her career, even if it wasn't
Yeah.
in the success that she wanted. I don't think they did that justice. And I know they've got a time frame. I get that. I get that they've
Uh-huh.
got, 45, 60 minutes per episode. But trust me, there are stuff that they could drop,
Yeah.
certainly for the expense of that.
Yeah.
Episode 9 is sort of, again, a bit more of a Tiafoe story because it kind of finishes episode 8 kind of halfway through the US Open and then
Mhm.
rejoins it, if you like, which is fine. Under Pressure is episode 9. It was at this point that I did make a quick note of Novak Djokovic, bearing in mind that they just touched on the whole Australian Open thing and his non-entry. It did get a brief mention. I still think they could have done a lot more with that regarding because that was a moment when tennis was in the news, if you like, and that would be a great way to
Yeah.
refresh things. But don't forget, there was still a 6 to 8 week story about will he, won't he be allowed in the US Open, and
Mhm.
maybe some people probably didn't know that quite so much. That wasn't such a well documented story compared to Australia. So maybe
Mhm.
they could even if they just did a bit of, how they do this sort of commentary over the top as the players are walking into the, they're checking their
Mhm.
bags in, they're having their badges checked, just one of these commentaries, of course. And of course, Rafa Nadal is going for a world record, 23 Grand Slams, and he might well do it given the fact that he's the favorite because Novak Djokovic isn't here. Just
Yeah.
those 2 lines as, this emotional pictures as they
Huh.
walk in with their badges and say good morning to everyone.
John, I think you might be right that the they came out with F1 first, right? Like 5, 6, 7 years ago. I think you might be right that they're just not really like maybe the producers just aren't really tennis fans and like they don't follow some of these storylines because to not mention Novak not being playing in the U.S. Open seems like insane to me. Um, it doesn't have to be the whole episode, but just like drop the line at the beginning of the episode or something, mention it.
I would
And
do
then
that, just a voiceover thing.
another thing they didn't cover, they showed Kyrgios smashing his racket after he lost to Kachanov. They didn't cover how big of a favorite Kyrgios was at that point because
Mm.
he made the finals of Wimbledon. He won like what did he win? Atlanta or DC or something. He won a few
I think he
tournaments
won
after
DC, but
that.
yeah. He
He
was
made
certainly on a good roll, and he
he
was
was
on a good roll
on
in
a
that tournament, beat
great
Medvedev
roll.
in a really good match.
Yeah, he was on a roll, and everyone, not everyone, a lot of people, I would say the majority of people at that point in the tournament were picking him to win the tournament
Mhm.
because Djokovic was out, Alcaraz was good but young, um, and he was in the best form. And like the loss to Kachanov was kind of a pretty big shock for most people, and they didn't really mention it.
Maybe
Um,
again I don't know. This is me just going probably
yeah,
some of the other stuff. Maybe they're just panning to Nick again, and they don't want to, say, this is a
maybe so.
shocking loss
Yeah,
for him. So
yeah, that could be.
anyway,
Yeah, yeah,
I've just written for this episode as well. Tiafo gets a big tick, both for him and also the story writers.
yeah.
I like the
It's
bit when
great.
Iga does reel off her titles. I thought that was quite a good question. Just tell us the titles you've won. And she says, you can look it up on Wikipedia. Go on. And then she reels them off, 6, 7, 8 titles that she'd won
She
that
is
year
funny.
until then. She is funny, yeah. And she also mentions in the final how she manages to keep her focus. I quite like some of that stuff with her team, and particularly
Yeah.
Daria Abramovich, who's on her team as well, the mental side of things. And she mentions how she does get distracted at one point because she sees Matthew Perry on the big screen.
Yeah, that was funny.
And she's a big Friends fan. So, yeah. But one more little negative. Well, no, let's go for one more positive. I like the exchange between Francis Tiafoe and Carlos after their pretty
Oh,
epic
that was great.
semi-final as well.
It
But
was.
there's also two matches that they just completely miss. One, Yannick Sinner against
Sinner
Alcaraz,
and
which
Alcaraz, yeah.
I
That was like
think
the match of the year.
absolutely. And I think you can. I know this is aimed at non-tennis fans, but we mustn't forget that there is a tennis match going on as well as relationships and breaking
Yeah.
down and smashed rackets and all the rest of it. I think we mustn't get away because actually, as much as they might be, people might be enjoying the drama, if they don't actually like the sport or understand the sport at all, then they're still not probably going to get into it. And I
Yeah.
think you can watch some of the shots in that match, and you can be a tennis connoisseur like us, or you can never have seen the sport before and still find it breathtaking.
Yeah.
And another match that they missed, the men's US Open final. As far as I'm concerned, there was a women's final, but nobody lifted the men's trophy. They got to the semifinals, and maybe even just somewhere in my mind, if I'm not a fan, I might think that the final was between Alcaraz and Tiafoe.
Yeah. Yeah, that is weird. I didn't even realize that they missed that because
Yeah, just
I don't
skipped it.
know.
As soon as it's finished, I
Yeah,
couldn't even
you're
believe it
right.
at the end of the episode. I
They
won't go into
fooled me.
I won't go into too much detail with you about the last episode. One, because you haven't seen it, and two, I know you have to leave. So just before you do leave, and I'll stay live with the audience a bit longer because I can talk about the last episode. Any final thoughts before I let you go, Will?
Two things. One, just to comment on Iga again, I knew that, it was publicly known that she's had this mental coach for a while. I thought the like filming of that and the interviewing, or filming like interactions between her and her coach was really cool. Uh, it kind of highlighted, when you watch her and then you watch like at least the way they portrayed it, you watch her and then you watch Tomlanovich. Um, it highlighted the difference between like number one and number like 30 or
Mm.
40 in the world,
Mm-hmm,
right? Like
mm-hmm.
she is every single, at least the way the documentary portrays it, every single thing about her day is structured around performing better in tennis, you know? And she's got her physio, her mental coach, her actual tennis coach, her
Mm-hmm.
team, like her meals, like all of it. And then they showed Tomjanovic and she's like heading to the coffee shop with her friends, right? Socializing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And to be honest with you, if I was like a top 100 player, I'd probably be more like Tomjanovic, because it looks
Yeah,
more
me
fun.
too.
It looks more fun to me.
Yeah.
But it did give me a little bit like an extra level of respect. I kind of knew that she had sort of that extra effort behind the scenes beforehand, but they did a good job of showing that. And then last thing, yeah, I haven't watched episode 10. I'm excited for it because I was at the WTA finals in Fort Worth. So I imagine I get some airtime in the background in the stands or something, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm excited to see that as well. So that
Yeah,
is
you
all I've
should be.
got.
There's one or two little gems that I'll mention when you've gone, basically. But no, I agree with you about the eager thing. I really liked. I mean, somebody's
Mhm.
mentioned Alia's dad in the commentary in the chat, and yeah, I don't know whether that what to think about that relationship in a way, but with Eager though, I liked what her coach said. We're not tourists. We're here to win titles.
Yeah.
Um,
Yep.
and yeah, and also maybe it helps that she's not really. She says I'm not a big social, bunny. I'm not really a fan of New York, and she sees herself in Times Square. But like anyway, regarding the series itself, there was some pretty good stuff, I would say, in episode 8 and 9. A
Mhm.
little bit in episode 10, but I'll go into that as you leave, Will.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, by the way, unless you want to say something else.
Uh, no, I guess last thing that came to mind actually, sorry, is
Go on. I'm happy for you to stay, but I know your time
no,
is.
I do have to run. I think since we talked about like them not showing actual tennis points, maybe at the start of next season, uh, they can dive a little bit more into the scoring or the strategy in a kind of a compelling way, because you're right, they missed a lot of the big matches at the US Open. And if they could help the fan understand like how matches are won, offense versus defense, getting to the net, why serving is so important in an interesting way, which, they're TV producers, I'm sure they can find a way. I think it might open up more possibilities for them in later episodes. So,
Also, sorry, Will, I know you want to go, but also when it comes to what you've just said, you know, on match point, what are you thinking? What are you doing? And
mhm,
you're probably taking it a bit more cautiously, funny enough, whether you're
yeah,
facing it and whether why is it that sometimes we're watching, often actually, I find myself watching a match and the longest rally of the match is in the fifth set. For some reason or another, go into that.
mhm,
There was an epic rally between Khachanov and Casper Ruud at the US Open semi-final last year, and also this point about being millimeters away from greatness.
mhm,
Francis Tiafoe double faulted against Rafa Nadal, and they could have gone close up on that because I remember just how
mhm,
close that was. And they just showed the double fault, and they went, "Oh, he's lost that set. It's one set all." But it was
yeah,
it was millimeters, and
yeah, yeah, yeah,
and every year, I can't think of many from this year, but I can remember some from other years. Every year there's a match where there's a match point. I remember Rafa Nadal having a match point in Barcelona, facing a match point in Barcelona in 2021, gets a net cord, ends up winning the point. Half an hour later, lifts the title.
yeah,
Sometimes it's 2 hours later.
yeah,
You're
yeah,
that,
it's
which is for
huge.
me one of the beauties of tennis compared to probably any other sport on the planet is you are the match is about to end basically, and it could be centimeters, it could be millimeters, it could be a net cord, or it could be an in-out call,
Mhm,
and then 3 hours later you've won or you've lost, and it's gone the other way. And
yeah,
you know, Medvedev Nadal, Australian Open 2022
mhm,
didn't really get much airtime either, and that was just a sensational, historic tennis match for all sorts of reasons.
yeah. Well, hopefully, they can do a little bit more of that next season. But
Indeed.
anyways, I gotta run, John. Thank
Will,
you.
sorry for keeping you so long. Take care. Have a good
No,
day.
you're good. Have a good one.
Cheers.
Bye.
Bye. As I suggested, I will be staying a little bit longer to talk about episode 10 and probably also just air one or two of my broader thoughts. Get me your thoughts in the live chat while you're still here to keep me company now that Will has gone. So, episode 10. And actually, it probably brings me to um, arguably the person I think comes across best of all the characters, of all the storylines. In this is how I see it, at least. She comes across in episode 10, and I'm like, what a really nice person. And yeah, I have a lot of sympathy for her, and it's Arina Sabalenka. You see her, and you see how she's reacting to how her year has been going, and also in terms of the some of the hate directed towards her, and how emotional she was, particularly at the French Open, I think, when things weren't going well for her. And she's in tears, and she's mentioning how everybody hates her. She also says, by the way, which is funny, she said, Iga's winning everything. It's so annoying. And it's just funny and human and real. She's obviously tempted to go on social media, onto Instagram, and she's seeing, unfortunately, some of the vitriolic abuse that she has to receive. And it hurts her. And it hurts her as well. Various other things that were going on. And I think she comes across probably as the most genuine tennis player on the tour, at least through this Netflix series, I would suggest. And that's not to take anything away from Iga, but also Francis Tiafoe. I think their stories are pretty interesting too, and were really well highlighted in episode 8. I do think that they probably big up the end of year tour finals in the WTA and ATP a bit too much. I don't know whether that was necessarily worthy of an entire episode, and if they were trying to cut time, because I mentioned so many things that they missed off from other episodes, I think that they could have done a little bit more, for example, on the last game of Serena Williams's career, and a little bit more on the Novak scenario, and a little bit more on Rafa in Australia. Because this brings me probably to my final point, and I will come to the live chat very quickly at the end before I close this. I wrote down some of the biggest storylines in tennis of 2022. Novak Djokovic in Australia and the whole situation with him being able to get in the country or not. Rafa Nadal beating Medvedev in that final and obviously lifting his 21st, as it was, Grand Slam at the time. Ash Barty's retirement. Iga Swiatek's unbelievable run from February, through to Wimbledon pretty much. Sinner Alcaraz Djokovic as a couple of matches as well. They were some of the, maybe there's others as well that I'm missing, but they were the sort of 6 or 7 biggest storylines for me in tennis of 2022. Did they do the Novak Djokovic scenario justice? No. Did they give enough airtime to the Rafa Nadal Australian Open miracle in Melbourne? No. Did they barely mention Ash Barty's retirement? One of the legends, I would argue, of the sport, having won Grand Slams on the 3 different surfaces that we have, including her last one in Australia, her emotional retirement as well, saying that she just felt as though, having won Wimbledon the year before, that she'd kind of completed tennis. No. Did they do Iga's run the justice it deserved when she did it? No. Did they do matches justice, such as Sinner Alcaraz or Djokovic Alcaraz? No. And I think that's probably the most damning indictment of the Netflix series so far. Thank you for stopping by. Make sure you hit the like button. Don't forget to subscribe. And I will be chatting to you all again very, very soon. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you hit that like button. Don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell so you don't miss out on all things tennis.